The sun hung low over the lawns of the subdivision, casting shadows across the brick driveways and trimmed hedges. On a sprawling back porch, two men sat in chairs, their coffee rising into the air. This was the world of Caleb and Elias, a world where life moved with a predictable grace. They had been inseparable since childhood, building similar lives. To any outsider, their friendship was the ideal of brotherhood, a bond forged in youth. Caleb, with his sharp suits and business, was the modern professional. Elias, a steady and thoughtful architect, provided the quiet strength that anchored them. They were leaders who figured out the delicate balance between achievement and devotion. However, beneath this polished surface, a subtle erosion was beginning to take place. Their friendship, once vibrant, had settled into a state of soft iron. They had reached a plateau where the goal was no longer growth, but affirmation. When Caleb spoke of his business triumphs, Elias nodded, celebrating without ever asking about the methods. When Elias shared minor frustrations, Caleb offered quick platitudes that felt more like bandages than surgery. They had become experts at keeping the peace, which meant they had become experts at avoiding the truth. They were like two stones tumbled together for so long that all their jagged edges had been worn down into a smooth roundness. They were comfortable, and in their comfort they became stagnant, drifting away from the sharpening friction that a true brotherhood requires. This stagnation began to manifest in Caleb's professional life first. As his firm expanded, the pressure to maintain his middle-class empire grew. It started with a small, imperceptible compromise. A slightly inflated invoice here, a creative interpretation there. Caleb justified these decisions as necessary for his employees and his family. He convinced himself that as long as his reputation remained intact, the internal rot didn't matter. Success was his shield, and he used it to deflect the quiet whispers of his own conscience. He felt untouchable, mistaking his material prosperity for divine approval. He was moving faster, but his spiritual edge was dulling with every shortcut he took, leaving him unprepared for the weight of the moral burden he was accumulating. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The concept of iron sharpens iron is often quoted as a pleasant sentiment found on greeting cards and wall art. But the proverb is far more visceral. To sharpen iron, there must be a collision. There must be heat, there must be pressure, and there must be the shedding of metal. It is a process of intentional destruction for the sake of a greater utility. Without that friction, the blade remains blunt, incapable of cutting through the complexities of a fallen world. Caleb and Elias had forgotten that a friend who never wounds you is a friend who cannot heal you. They had traded the transformative power of holy confrontation for the shallow satisfaction of constant agreement, leaving them both vulnerable to the things they claimed to stand against. The first true crack in the facade appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when Elias stopped by Caleb's office, unannounced. He found Caleb over a ledger, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he ended a tense phone call. There was a frantic energy in the room that didn't match the calm persona Caleb wore in public. On the desk lay a document that caught Elias's eye, a partnership agreement with a firm known for predatory practices, something Caleb once vowed never to touch. In that moment, the air grew heavy with an unspoken truth. Elias looked at his oldest friend and saw a stranger. A necessary rebuke formed in his throat, a sharp edge ready to meet Caleb's compromise. But as he looked at Caleb's tired eyes, Elias hesitated. He felt the pull of their decades-long comfort, the fear of breaking the easy peace they had cultivated. He stood on the precipice of a choice, to be the iron that sharpens, or the silence that allows a brother to fall. The afternoon light through the window felt cold as Elias gripped the back of a chair. his heart warring between the safety of a lie and the danger of the truth. The silence in the office stretched thin, like a wire pulled to the point of snapping. Elias looked from the document to his friend's face, sensing the tension radiating from Caleb. For years, they had danced around hard truths, preferring mutual admiration to the harsh light of accountability. But the predatory contract was a bridge too far. Elias felt a weight in his chest, a holy agitation that refused to be quelled. He took a deep breath and pointed a finger at the signature line. He asked Caleb if this was the man he had set out to be when they prayed over their first business plans. He spoke of their shared values and the integrity they had promised to uphold at any cost. Caleb reacted instantaneously. He didn't hang his head. Instead, his posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. He felt the sting of Elias's words, not as a healing wound, but as a betrayal. To Caleb, this wasn't an act of love. It was an ambush. He snatched the paper away, his voice vibrating with a suppressed rage that had been simmering for months. He began to justify the deal, painting himself as a martyr for his company's survival. He accused Elias of living in a world of blueprints where everything was clean, while he dealt with the mud of the real market. He dismissed his friend's perspective as a naive luxury. This was the anatomy of a spark. When two pieces of iron strike one another, the friction creates intense, localized heat. Heat allows reshaping, but causes a spray of fire. Most people want the sharp edge without the burning spray. They want strength of character without the searing discomfort of being told they are wrong. The biblical principle of sharpening is inherently violent to the ego. Caleb wasn't ready to be stripped. He saw the sparks as an attack on his identity rather than a refinement of his soul. He focused on the pain of the friction rather than the purpose of the tool. As the heat in the room rose, the conversation shifted from the contract to their history. Deflection is the favorite weapon of pride. Caleb, desperate to move the spotlight away from his compromise, reminded Elias of a season 5 years prior when Elias had stumbled in his own judgment. He threw the memory back like a grenade, hoping the blast would force Elias to retreat. He asked Elias who he thought he was to stand as a judge, reminding him that they both had glass houses. Their past became a weapon. The brotherhood meant to protect was now being used to destroy. Caleb's words were calculated to wound, a defensive wall built of his friend's past failures. The rift widened with every word. Elias realized that his friend was no longer listening to the spirit of the rebuke, but was only hearing the noise of his own defensiveness. The silence that followed was no longer comfortable. It was the heavy silence of a battlefield after the guns go quiet. Elias stood up, his heart heavy with a grief he couldn't articulate. He looked at Caleb one last time, hoping to see a flicker of the man he knew, but found only a stranger armored in arrogance. He walked out without another word, leaving the door slightly ajar, a symbolic opening that Caleb would soon choose to close with a decisive click. Alone, Caleb felt a hollow victory. He had defended his position, but at the cost of the only person who truly knew his heart. The sting of the confrontation lingered, a persistent itch he tried to scratch away with thoughts of success. He convinced himself that Elias was simply jealous of his influence. He decided he needed a new circle, men who understood high-stakes business, men who wouldn't bring up moral codes over a simple contract. He reached for his phone, scrolling past Elias's name to find the contacts of those soft friends who always told him what he wanted to hear. He sought the numbing comfort of affirmation, unaware that a dull blade is the first to break. The path ahead seemed smooth, but it was a descent he was choosing to walk alone, away from the friction that could have saved him. The click of the lock felt like a definitive period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. Caleb stood alone in his office, the silence no longer a burden, but a sanctuary of his own making. He told himself he was finally free from the suffocating scrutiny of a man who didn't understand the pressures of his world. Within weeks, The space Elias left was filled by a new set of voices, colleagues and acquaintances who practiced the art of cheap grace. These were men who viewed accountability as an outdated intrusion and saw success as the ultimate sign of divine favor. They offered Caleb a mirror that only showed his best angles, reflecting back a distorted image of a man who was winning, even as his soul began to lose its footing. In this new circle, the conversations were light, the laughter was frequent, and the moral boundaries were as flexible as the terms of a predatory loan. This transition into soft fellowship acted as a sedative for Caleb's conscience. Without the sharpening friction of a true brother, his spiritual life didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it withered through neglect. His morning prayers, once a time of honest confession, devolved into a checklist of material requests. The scriptures that used to challenge him now sat on his bedside table, gathering dust as he sought wisdom from self-help gurus who promised prosperity without repentance. His life became like a blade that had stopped meeting the whetstone. On the surface, it was polished and gleaming, but its edge was gone. He was no longer equipped to cut through the deceptions of his own heart, and the compromises that had once made him tremble now felt like necessary strategic maneuvers. He convinced himself that as long as he was providing for his family and appearing in the pews on Sunday, the details of his business ethics didn't truly matter. Miles away, Elias sat in the quiet of his living room, the weight of the wound of a friend pressing heavily against his chest. He replayed the confrontation 1,000 times, wondering if his tone had been too sharp or his timing too abrupt. There is a specific kind of grief reserved for those who lose a brother to pride. He felt the phantom pain of a severed limb, a constant reminder of the years they had spent building one another up. Elias struggled with the nagging doubt that perhaps he should have stayed silent, that perhaps the peace of the relationship was worth the price of the truth. But deep in his spirit, he knew that a peace bought with a lie is no peace at all. He prayed for Caleb not with bitterness, but with the desperate hope of a man watching a ship sail toward a rocky shore, unable to signal the danger because the captain had turned off the radio. The world defines friendship as a mutual admiration society, a pact to never point out the spinach between the teeth or the rot in the heart. But Christian fellowship is a commitment to the holiness of the other, even when that pursuit requires the shedding of tears and the breaking of ego. Caleb was experiencing the seductive warmth of worldly affirmation, a comfort that feels like a blanket but acts like a shroud. He was trading a friend who loved him enough to hurt him for a crowd that liked him enough to let him perish. This soft fellowship offered no resistance, and without resistance, there can be no growth, only a slow, comfortable slide into mediocrity. The inevitable consequence of a dull blade is that it fails when the pressure is greatest. The predatory firm Caleb had partnered with wasn't interested in his success. They were interested in his assets. By the time the first subpoena arrived at his office, the soft friends were already beginning to distance themselves. The cheap grace they had offered didn't cover legal fees or public scandal. The ethical shortcuts he had taken to save his company were now the very things the authorities were using to dismantle it. The facade of the polished businessman began to crack, revealing a man who had no spiritual armor left to withstand the storm. Late on a Friday evening, as the shadows of his empty office grew long and cold, Caleb sat staring at a stack of documents that spelled the end of his reputation. His phone vibrated on the desk. He expected it to be his lawyer or perhaps a message of abandonment from one of his new associates. Instead, the screen displayed a number he hadn't seen in months, but it wasn't the number he secretly hoped for. It wasn't Elias. It was a voice from the past he thought he had buried, an old enemy who represented the very darkness he had tried to navigate alone. The voice on the line was a cold reminder of every corner Caleb had cut. It was the old enemy, a figure who thrived on the leverage Caleb provided through recent compromises. He didn't offer help, he offered a threat. When the call ended, Caleb reached for those he had called friends for months. He sent messages and made calls, looking for the validation he had grown addicted to. But the responses were different now. Cheap grace had a sudden, steep price. One by one, the men who toasted his success found reasons to be elsewhere. Their social media feeds were scrubbed clean of his image. They didn't want the stain of his impending legal battle on their reputations. Caleb went from being the absolute center of a thriving network to a ghost in his own industry. In the jarring vacuum of his social life, Caleb was forced to confront the architecture of his own soul. For months, he had mistaken the absence of conflict for the presence of peace. Now, sitting in a home that felt too large and a life that felt too hollow, he realized the truth. He had become a dull blade. When the storm hit, he lacked the sharpness to cut through deception or the strength to withstand the wind. He was brittle. This is the divine economy of suffering. God removes earthly crutches to show how much we have limped from the truth. The isolation wasn't a punishment, but a sterile environment where the infection of pride could be lanced. He hungered for a word that wasn't a lie, a solid piece of truth to anchor his drifting spirit. The silence was deafening, amplified by the realization that he had traded a diamond for glass. He looked at an old photo on his desk, hidden under legal subpoenas. It was from 5 years ago, he and Elias, after a grueling hike. He remembered how his boots had failed, and Elias had literally given Caleb the socks off his own feet, walking the final miles in pain to ensure Caleb didn't get blisters. Back then, the wounds Elias gave him were verbal, hard truths about his temper or tendency to overpromise, but they were always delivered while Elias was physically carrying the weight alongside him. Caleb realized the friction he fled was actually his greatest protection. Elias's rebukes weren't stones thrown to hurt. They were the whetstones intended to keep him functional. Without that sharpening, Caleb had been filed down by the world until there was nothing left but a useless piece of soft metal. He was unprepared for the trial because he had surrounded himself with people who refused to train him for it. The urge to call Elias was a physical ache, a pressure making it hard to breathe. He picked up his phone a dozen times, his thumb hovering over the name. But pride is a persistent ghost. It whispered that Elias would only gloat, that the shame would be too much. He feared rejection more than the legal consequences of his failures. How could he return to the man he had insulted? How could he admit the soft friends he chose over a brother were merely vultures? He paced his living room, shadows lengthening like bars of a cell. He felt trapped by his choices, a prisoner of a freedom he had fought to obtain. He wanted to confess, but he was terrified that the door to grace had been locked from the outside. Night fell, and the house grew cold. Caleb sat in the dark, the glow of his phone the only light. He felt the weight of every compromise and every moment of arrogance. He was waiting for the inevitable, the knock of a process server or the call announcing his final collapse. Instead, a different sound echoed through the hallway, a firm, rhythmic knocking at his front door. It wasn't the frantic pounding of an enemy or the polite tap of a stranger. It was a familiar cadence. Heart racing, Caleb walked toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He pulled it open with a heavy heart, and there in the porch light stood Elias. He wasn't holding a subpoena. He was just there, his face etched with steady concern. He hadn't waited for a call to show up. Elias stepped across the threshold without waiting for an invitation, his presence immediately filling the hollow, silent entryway with a weight that was both terrifying and grounding. Caleb stood back, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, the air between them thick with the unsaid apologies and the sharp echoes of their last confrontation. He had spent weeks imagining this moment, bracing himself for a lecture or a stern reminder of the warnings he had discarded like junk mail. But as Elias looked at him, there was no sign of a pedestal. Instead, Elias walked straight into the dining room, where the table was a chaotic landscape of legal notices, crumpled receipts, and half-empty coffee mugs. He pulled out a chair, his movements deliberate and calm, and gestured for Caleb to sit. He looked at the mess, not just the scattered paper, but the broken man standing before him, with a gaze that was surgical in its precision, yet profoundly divine in its compassion. "I am not here to discuss why you didn't listen," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to anchor Caleb's spiraling thoughts to the floor. "I'm here because the blade is blunt, and we have work to do. How deep does the rot go, Caleb? I need you to tell me everything, without the polish and without the excuses." The dam that Caleb had spent months reinforcing finally cracked. He slumped into the chair opposite his friend, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged, hollow sob that felt like it had been vibrating in his chest since the first subpoena arrived. The confession wasn't a neat, organized summary. It was a visceral, painful purging of every lie he had told himself and every ethical corner he had rounded in the desperate pursuit of success. He spoke of the inflated invoices, the silenced whistleblowers, and the intoxicating, dangerous feeling of being untouchable that his soft friends had nurtured in him. He admitted that he had come to crave the lack of friction, never realizing that a life without resistance is a life that loses its edge until it becomes useless. As he spoke, the shame felt like a physical heat, a refiner's furnace meant to melt away the dross of his pride. Elias listened in silence, his face a mask of sorrow, but his eyes burned with the focused fire of a man who refused to let his brother drown in his own choices. When the last of the confession had been poured out, the room grew silent again. But the atmosphere had shifted from cold isolation to the heavy heat of accountability. Elias didn't offer a shallow word of comfort or a promise that everything would be resolved by morning. That would have been more of the soft iron that had led Caleb to this precipice. Instead, Elias reached across the table and tapped a particularly damning legal document with a steady finger. "Restoration begins with the truth, and the truth is going to cost you your comfort," he stated firmly. He began to outline a plan that felt like a death sentence to Caleb's remaining ego. It involved full, unprompted disclosure to the authorities, an immediate resignation from his position, and the liquidation of his personal assets to provide restitution to those he had defrauded. It was the iron sharpens iron principle in its most brutal and beautiful form. The friction was intense, and sparks of defensiveness flew as Caleb initially recoiled at the sheer magnitude of the sacrifice. But Elias stood his ground like an unyielding whetstone, refusing to let Caleb settle for a superficial, outward fix. They spent the remaining hours of the night in the trenches of active repentance. This was not the rhythmic, hollow prayer of their comfortable years. It was a battle cry, a gritty and desperate reaching for a grace that was sufficient but never cheap. Caleb realized with a piercing clarity that the wounds Elias was inflicting with his hard words were the only things keeping his spirit from atrophying completely. The pain of the truth was a mercy compared to the slow death of the lie. They eventually knelt on the hardwood floor together, two men forged in the same childhood memories, now being retempered for a far more difficult season. The resilience was returning to Caleb's soul, not through the restoration of his wealth, but through the strengthening of a character that had been nearly filed away by the world. However, the shadows of Caleb's compromised past were not so easily dismissed by a single night of honesty. Just as they began to draft the first letter of confession, Caleb's phone chimed with a sharp, intrusive notification. He glanced at the screen, and the blood drained from his face. It was an encrypted message from the old enemy, the figure from the predatory firm who held the evidence of Caleb's deepest compromises. The message was a direct threat, a piece of digital extortion that didn't just target Caleb's final remnants of reputation. It contained a photograph of Elias's own office, accompanied by a warning that if Caleb moved toward the truth, he would drag his only true friend down into the fire with him. The restoration had barely begun, and already the enemy was preparing to strike at the very bond that was keeping Caleb alive. Caleb felt the cold seep into his marrow as he stared at the small, glowing screen. The image of Elias's office building, captured from across the street at dusk, was a silent, predatory promise. The message underneath was even darker and colder. Silence is a small price for a friend's safety. Choose wisely. For a moment, the old Caleb, the man of easy compromises, reared his head. It would be so simple to bury the confession letters and let the rot remain hidden under professional paint. If it were just his own soul at stake, Caleb might have failed. But the thought of Elias's unblemished reputation being dragged into the gutter because of his own sins felt like a physical blow. He looked at Elias, who sat across from him at the table, unaware that the target had moved from the guilty to the innocent. "I can't do this," Caleb whispered. He slid the phone across the table, expecting to see the color drain from Elias's face, expecting the fear that had dictated his own life to finally take root in his friend. But as Elias studied the digital threat, his jaw didn't tremble. His eyes didn't dart around looking for an exit or a way to distance himself from the fire. Instead, he looked up with a terrifyingly calm clarity. He told Caleb that a blade is not just sharpened for show, it is sharpened for the harvest and the battle. If his reputation was the price of Caleb's integrity, then it was a price he had already counted. This was the ultimate test. The temptation of a convenient lie, one that would protect Elias while leaving Caleb's heart in chains, was the last lingering shadow of the soft fellowship that had nearly destroyed them. Together, they moved with a singular resolve they had never known in their years of shallow comfort. There was no more hesitation or weighing the cost of the truth. They spent 48 hours preparing for a confrontation that would dismantle everything they had built in the eyes of the world. Caleb felt a strange lightness, even as the weight of ruin grew heavier. For the first time, he wasn't acting to save himself. He was acting to honor the truth Elias brought into his life. They were no longer two separate men navigating a crisis. They were two blades working in perfect unison, the friction between them having created an edge that could finally cut through the web of deceit. The climax came in a sterile conference room in the city's financial district. The old enemy sat at the head of the table, flanked by the very soft friends who had once toasted to Caleb's success. They expected a broken man ready to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They expected Caleb to beg for the photograph and the evidence to be deleted. Instead, they found two men forged in a furnace. When Caleb began to speak, his voice wasn't a plea. It was a steady declaration. He laid out the evidence of his own crimes and the extortion attempt, refusing to let shadows dictate his life. The room erupted in threats, but Elias stood behind Caleb's chair, his presence a silent shield. Elias's own standing began to crumble as the connections to Caleb's scandal were made public, yet he didn't flinch. He chose the hard truth over the comfortable lie, proving that his love for Caleb wasn't based on what Caleb could do for him, but on who Caleb was called to be. The soft world recoiled in disgust. To them, this was professional suicide, but as Caleb looked into the eyes of his old associates, he saw the same dull existence he had just escaped. He was a truly different man, stripped of status, but filled with a resilience that no legal fallout could touch. He had lost his company and his standing, but he had regained his soul. He stood taller than he ever had in the days of his hollow success. The victory was in the character they had forged together. As they finally walked out into the harsh light and the public fallout, Caleb realized the transformation was deeply profound, but the path toward true restitution was only just beginning to unfold now. The aftermath of the confession was not a sudden burst of sunlight, but a slow grey dawn. Caleb's corporate empire did not recover. The legal fees and the loss of trust from his former associates saw to that. He moved from his sprawling suburban estate to a modest apartment on the edge of the city, a place where the rooms were smaller, but the air felt significantly easier to breathe. Every box he unpacked was a reminder of what he had lost. Yet as he placed a framed photo of his childhood with Elias on a simple wooden bookshelf, he realized he had never been wealthier. The foundation of his life was no longer built on the shifting sands of success and approval, but on the bedrock of a truth that had been tested by fire. Elias remained a constant presence, not as a crutch, but as a fellow soldier in a war that was finally being won. Their relationship had shifted from the soft iron of their youth into a tempered, resilient bond that the rest of their community began to notice. It was not long before the quiet corners of their church, once filled with polite nods and shallow greetings, began to hum with a different kind of energy. People saw Caleb and Elias not as a cautionary tale of a fallen businessman and his loyal friend, but as a blueprint for what it meant to actually follow the way. They had moved the needle from nice to holy, showing their peers that a friendship without the courage to confront is merely a slow-motion tragedy. The community started to understand that love was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of a commitment so deep that it was willing to endure the heat of a necessary argument to save a soul from stagnation. This was the living embodiment of the ancient wisdom found in Proverbs 27, verse 17. The world often quotes the phrase, "Iron sharpens iron," as if it describes a pleasant afternoon chat over coffee. But Caleb and Elias knew the gritty reality behind the metaphor. To sharpen iron, there must be a collision. There must be friction that generates heat and throws off sparks. There must be the intentional grinding away of the dull, rusted edges to reveal the shining, lethal steel beneath. Without that friction, a tool eventually becomes useless, unable to cut through the complexities of life or the deceptions of the heart. Caleb looked at his hands, once soft from the ease of his compromises, and saw a man who was finally becoming a sharp instrument in the hands of his Creator. The narrative of their lives now calls out to every soul sitting in the comfort of a soft fellowship. It is a plea to look at the people closest to you and ask if they love you enough to hurt you. We are often tempted to surround ourselves with mirrors that only reflect our best angles, friends who offer a cheap grace that never demands change. But those friends are not anchors. They are weights that pull us into the depths of mediocrity. True Christian brotherhood is a commitment to the discomfort of growth. It is the willingness to be the whetstone for someone else's soul, even when the process makes your own hands bleed. It is the understanding that a wound from a friend is 1,000 times better than the kiss of an enemy who cheers for your destruction. In a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, the legacy began to take root in the next generation. Caleb and Elias sat on a weathered bench, surrounded by 3 younger men from their congregation who had watched the storm and wondered how the two had remained standing. There were no polished speeches or easy answers. Caleb spoke openly about the shame of his compromise, the terror of the fallout, and the agonizing beauty of Elias's refusal to let him stay hidden. He showed them that the strength of their bond was not in their similarities, but in their willingness to clash for the sake of the truth. As the younger men listened, the cycle of soft iron was broken. They saw that a sharpened life was not a life without failure, but a life that refused to let failure have the final word. The cost of their journey had been immense. Caleb's bank account was a fraction of what it once was, and Elias's reputation still bore the faint scars of his association with the scandal. But as they walked together toward the sunset, their shadows long and steady against the pavement, they knew the reward far outweighed the price. They were no longer dull blades destined for the scrap heap of history. They were sharpened, ready, and resilient. To be a brother is to be a refiner. To be a friend is to be a flame. In the end, the iron had been sharpened, and the edge it produced was meant to last for eternity.